Well, hello, Nativity Bible Heads. It is Dr. Wayne, and it is time for a Sunday morning Power Bible Study, lectionary Power Bible Study for the last Sunday after the Epiphany. The last Sunday means the one after it, we go to Lent. We are looking at texts. So typically when we are at that point of the last Sunday of Epiphany, we always turn to the Transfiguration event. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very consistent in that they all narrate the events of Jesus' baptism, and his transfiguration. John, not so much. John mentions that Jesus was baptized, but he doesn't really narrate that Jesus was baptized, and there's no transfiguration in John. But in the Synoptic Gospels, the Transfiguration plays a very significant account. It's like the midway point, usually, of each gospel that's narrated. Now, we're going to be in Genesis 34. We're going to be looking at Psalm 99. We're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and Luke chapter 9. We're going to start with the Old Testament passage from, I said Genesis? I meant Exodus. Exodus 34. And it's, anytime we're dealing with Exodus, we got to remember that what we're dealing with is Moses leading the people. Remember, Exodus is where they actually left. That's what Exodus means. Exodus is when they actually left Egypt. They wandered in the wilderness, and they go to Mount Sinai. And they stay at the foot of Mount Sinai for quite a while. If you read the narrative straight through, Moses goes up and down the mountain about 5 different times. This is one of those. In Exodus 34, verse 29. Moses came down from Mount Sinai as he came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hand. Oh, by the way, this isn't the first time he came down with the tablets. Remember, the first time he came down with the tablets was when the golden calf incident was going on, and he breaks the tablets, right? Well, this isn't that time. This is after that. As he came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant, by the way, that word covenant is very interesting because it doesn't really mean commandments. It means more like treaty. We all know what a treaty is, right? It's something that is usually hammered out between people who are at war, right? And it's kind of like a cessation of hostilities kind of a thing. And okay, it says if we're going to get along, this is what's got to happen. So that's the word that gets translated as covenant. And it's a very ancient kind of a word because it really points to the fact that salvation has happened, okay? The Lord has saved them. Salvation is in the background. The question now is, how do we properly respond to God having that salvation in hand, okay? So he comes down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hand. Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God, okay? The word shone there is probably, I had a better word for that, and I can't remember what it was. More like radiant. It's like it was radiant. Ooh, remember, how people will say that, sometimes they'll say of pregnant women that they're glowing. Well, it's kind of that. So yeah, the face of his skin shone because he'd been talking with God. Now, this is a part of our text for the last Sunday after the Epiphany, the Transfiguration, because we're, as you may recall, when, and we'll see this when we read Luke, that when Jesus was in his transfiguration, that his face also shone. So this sets a kind of a paradigm, if you will, for that event. Verse 30. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face was shining, and they were afraid to come near him. Fear is a human response to divinity. And the glowing face is something that had them know that, wow, he's been in the presence of God. No other explanation for it. This is the way that works. Verse 31, but Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses spoke with them. We're not told what he told them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near, and he gave them in commandment all that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. And there was more than just the Ten Commandments, by the way. There was the whole thing about building the tabernacle, and all kinds of other commandments were given up there. It wasn't just the 10 words, the Decalogue, as we call it. It was much more than that. Verse 33, when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil on his face. Now, the word veil, I know, when we hear the word veil, we think of scarves or, like see-through things like an I Dream of Jeannie or, some sort of a diaphane, No, it's like the word mask. It's the same thing as mask, okay? We know the word mask today, don't we? Yes, we do. So yeah, he put a mask on his face, okay? So you don't want to picture him like, putting a scarf or I mean, it could be. I mean, you've seen the way in the Middle East they will wrap around their face, and so all you can see is their eyes. Yeah, well, that's kind of what we're talking about. But the word mask communicates it as well, especially since it's got so much today in today's day and age. It's like it's got so much connotations. It's like, okay, well, let's get comfortable with that. All right. When Moses, he put verse 34. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take the veil off, the mask, until he came out. And when he came out, he told the Israelites what he had been commanded. The Israelites would see the face of Moses, that the skin of his face was shining, and Moses would put the veil on his face again until he went in to speak with him. So there's a lot of emphasis here on the shining face and the fact that the people just can't handle it, okay? Maybe that's the context we need to think of, especially if we're annoyed at seeing our worship leaders wearing masks, right? Or not. There was debate amongst the rabbis about, to what extent did he wear the mask? Like, did he talk with the mask? Did he take the mask off? Did he only take the mask off when he was talking? And to what extent did he wear the mask? And how long did he have to wear the mask after seeing and all of that? Moses has a special position with God, obviously. And some commentators will talk about this as being an argument for ordination, the idea that there are certain people that are allowed certain access to God, and then relating that to the people. I don't know if we need to go that far, but we're going to see more of this connection when we see the transfiguration with Jesus. Remember, Moses came to represent the preeminent lawgiver. He was even considered to be a priest. Well, we'll see that in our psalm reading, actually, in Psalm 99. Actually, let's go to Psalm 99 right now. I am going to read it out of the Book of Common Prayer. One of the reasons why I like the translation in the Book of Common Prayer, or why I like to use it for these studies, is that number one, that's what we use in our Episcopal worship, and number two, it's more translated for public worship, and so it's more, it's easier on the, it's easier, I don't know, verbiage wise. When we read it in our New Revised Standard, it's not so much caring for, oh, can we use this for public worship, but we will use it here in our study in the Book of Common Prayer. Verse 1, Psalm 98, the Lord is king, let the people tremble. He is enthroned upon the cherubim, let the earth shake. Okay, so anytime we see L-O-R-D in all caps, that's the tetragrammaton, that's the covenant name for God, right? So it's referring to the Lord being, typically we see Israel's God being talked about as being the God of all gods, and like the one before whom everyone trembles, okay? Doesn't matter whether or not you are a worshiper or not, he demands that kind of attention. Notice it mentions he's enthroned upon the cherubim, okay? The cherubim, remember the I am ending is a plural, masculine plural ending in Hebrew. The cherubim are the figures on top of, on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, okay? They're kind of like this. And if you can imagine this as being put together and like somebody sitting in that right there, that's the way the Israelites viewed God, that the Ark of the Covenant was a throne where their invisible God sat upon, okay? So this is what we call an enthronement psalm. There are several enthronement psalms, and it might even be something that they used liturgically when a king would ascend to the throne, very possibly. Look at verse 2. The Lord is great in Zion. He is high above all peoples. Remember, when we see the word Zion, Zion is actually the name of a hill in Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem is made up of several hills, okay? Zion is the hill upon which the temple was built. There's a temple there now. It's a mosque, but it's not a Hebrew temple. There are hills that are higher than it. In fact, Mount Olives, right on the other side of the valley. You can actually look down on Mount Zion. It's a wonderful view. The Lord is great in Zion. He is high above his peoples. In fact, some people think that it's possible that the imagery here is that somehow that Zion might even be the footstool of the Lord. Okay, if you can imagine a Lord so large that the cherubim are somewhere up in the ethers, and what is Mount Zion but the footstool for the Lord? Very possible that imagery was what they had in mind. Verse 3. Let them confess his name, which is great and awesome. He is the Holy One. O mighty King, lover of justice, you have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. So as you can see in our translation, there's quotations around that. So it's very possible this was done responsorially, right? With declarations from the priests, declarations from the people, declarations from the king himself. Liturgical use of the Psalms, yes, it definitely was used liturgically. They didn't just use them as, it's not that different from the way we use it as a responsive reading, although I'm guessing they had, there probably was more to it with them. But know that this is liturgically oriented. Verse 5, proclaim the greatness of the Lord our God and fall down before his footstool. He is the Holy One. So this one, kind of imagine, if you can imagine the ark being that footstool, maybe, okay? Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's people outside, on Mount Zion, okay? Moses and Aaron among his priests, and Samuel among those who called upon his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them. So the mention of Moses and Aaron And Samuel, it's very unusual to hear Samuel mentioned in a litany, a list of interlocutors with God, priests, and what have you. But he is listed here. He was known as being a prophet as well, the first of the prophets. So we have the transition here. Remember, Samuel was a transition kind of a person. Okay. The last judge, the first prophet, but he was a priest, okay? And remember, his sons weren't so, trustworthy, and so the priesthood changed at that point. Well, anyway, verse 7. He spoke to them out of the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the decree that he gave them. The mention of the pillar of cloud, yes, it recalls the Exodus, where we saw that the pillar of cloud was something that guided them. I can't remember if the pillar went behind them. There was a pillar of cloud, and then there was a pillar of fire. I can't remember which one before and which one after, but it brings up that imagery of the Exodus, and it also provides the imagery for what we get when we read the Transfiguration story with Jesus. Verse 8, O Lord our God, you answered them indeed. You were a God who forgave them, yet punished them for their evil deeds. That could be a congregational kind of response. If it is in quotations, it's one way of reading it. Verse 9, last verse. Proclaim the greatness of the Lord our God and worship him upon his holy hill. For the Lord our God is the Holy One. Verses 5 and 9 are basically exactly the same. The first 5 set a grandiose picture of worship, and then the last verses bring it down into history. So this is fitting in with our theme of transfiguration. We're going to move on. We're going to talk. We're going to go to. I'm going to save the gospel for last. We're going to do 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Now, in 2 Corinthians, oh boy. So, our readings from our epistle readings lately have been from 1 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians, Paul is really fighting desperately to talk to his people about the fact that his apostleship is valid, and that they should not follow these super apostles, which he uses that expression not in this passage, but he's being very defensive, and these other teachers, they were Christian, they were Jewish, but they had belittled Paul's ministry to the point that, and it's interesting if you think about it, we don't get any writings from them that got preserved, no. But we got to realize that a lot of the writings we have of Paul, he's reacting to something, okay? Just remember that. So we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and going through starting in verse 12 and going through chapter 4, verse 2. Since then, we have such a hope, we act with great boldness. The hope he's talking about is the fact he's been talking about, or he had been in our 1 Corinthians readings from the previous few weeks, resurrection and all of that, and the hope that we have of resurrection because he was resurrected. We think that that's probably what he's referring to here. Since then, we have such a hope. We act with great boldness. Not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to keep the people of Israel from gazing at the end of the glory that was being set aside. Okay, Paul is appearing to kind of throw Moses under the bus a little, in that he's sort of, the masking that Moses did is like, well, we don't have to worry about that. We're going to be closer to God than Moses. He's not really putting Moses down so much as he is trying to say that the closeness that that Moses experienced with God, that's in store for us as well, okay? But their minds were hardened. He's talking about He's talking about the Israelites. But their minds were hardened. Indeed, to this very day, when they hear the reading of the Old Covenant, that same veil is still there, since only in Christ is it set aside. So Paul is kind of like saying that, remember, Paul himself was Jewish, okay? He's not trying to put down Judaism, but he is trying to show and demonstrate that Christ completes Judaism, that it completes it in the sense of like, this was where God was going all along, okay? And now he's suggesting that that veil was an encumbrance, okay? And and he takes it from seeing it as something that Moses wore, but no, that veil is over all of their faces, so everybody is just a little bit masked, if you will, and not barefaced before God. But in Christ, as he says, that is when it is set aside. So for Paul, the coming of Christ totally was a total game changer in that whole realm of asking the question, well, how do we know God? Well, we know God intimately, face to face. Look, verse 15. Indeed, to this very day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their minds. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. So he's using the metaphor of the veil, the mask, as something that impedes direct contact with God. Paul is arguing for the fact that when we recognize the value of what Christ has done in God's overall plan, that veil is totally gone. Now, verse 17, the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us, I remember once going to a revival. Revival always starts with the revival preacher always preaches his first sermon on the Sunday morning, and I remember being at a church some point visiting, and a preacher preached on just this one verse. And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. So, Paul, so you remember how that I mentioned that in that Old Testament passage from Exodus, sometimes people will use that as an argument for ordination, and how it sets some people up as being a conduit for God because of the fact that there's some sort of a special. Well, this one is kind of used for people arguing from the opposite side, saying, "Hey, we all got unveiled faces, so you choose your poison there." This is what he is. So this verse of 3:18. I remember some guy did a whole seminar, whole series on just this, the idea that we have an unveiled face is seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror. Really? Can you imagine? One of my goals, I'm recording this before my trip to Israel, and I know this is for the 27th, but I'm recording it before my trip to Israel. But one of my goals is to actually see in people's faces the glory of the Lord. Can I do that in Phoenix? Yeah, I could. But I'm not really living in pilgrimage in Phoenix now, am I? No, I'm not. So this is what one of the things that Paul turns me on to. All of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror. It's like, can we look in the mirror and see ourselves and also see the Lord? What a great idea, right? Well, this is what Paul suggests is possible, because he says that we are being transformed into the same image. Oh, yes, This is what gives us hope as human beings, as people loved by God. The idea that we are being transformed, whether, it doesn't matter whether or not we like how we look in the mirror. You know what? What's really happening? You know what's really happening? Yeah. We are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. There's two more verses here, verses 1 and 2 from chapter 4. Therefore, since it is by God's mercy that we are engaged in this ministry, we do not lose heart. Can you imagine? This is what Paul sees his ministry as doing, introducing people to this kind of a relationship with God. And this is why he is so perturbed, I guess you could say, about these super apostles, those other preachers that are advocating continuing the religiosity of the Judaism. And he's saying, that's what he means by, therefore, it is by God's mercy that we are engaged in this ministry. See, teaching people about how they can have unveiled faces. Verse 2, we have renounced the shameful things that one hides. We refuse to practice cunning or to falsify God's word, but by the open statement of the truth, we commend ourselves to the conscience of everyone in the sight of God. This is a defense of what he's doing ministry-wise, okay? So this is, and that clearly comes out in the end. And he's trying to distinguish what it is that he has to offer as a minister as opposed to these other people. Okay, we are moving on to the gospel. This is in Luke chapter 9. It is the story that Luke conveys of Jesus' transfiguration. And it begins in chapter 9, verse 28. And we're going to go through verse 36. There's an optional thing of verses 37 to 43, but we're not going to do those. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, right there, 8 days after. This isn't just a happenstance, kind of like, oh, Luke is looking at the calendar. And no, the 8 days is very significant. 8 days. What does 8 days mean? 8 days mean a full week and then the day off. Easter is considered an 8th day kind of a celebration. Why? Because of the fact that the resurrection happened on the first day of the week. And then, so the 8th day is the 7 days after, celebrating that again, okay? So the idea of the 8th day is kind of a resurrection idea to begin with, anytime 8 days is mentioned. And so some scholars will contend that what we have in the Transfiguration story is a misplaced or a whatever, however you want to call it, but a resurrection appearance kind of a narrative, but that it's been put in the midst of Jesus' ministry. I don't know that we necessarily need to go there, but the fact that Luke says it's 8 days after he's the only gospel writer that does this. Remember, only Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a telling of the Transfiguration. Only Luke is the one who mentions anything about 8 days, okay? And all of the stuff that happens before that, it's like there's no logic of why it would be 8 days later. It's clearly symbolic that what we're getting here is a proleptic view of the reality of who Jesus is. Okay. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. Jesus does a lot of things in Luke significant that happen after prayer, okay? Choosing the disciples, getting baptized. Here, the Garden of Gethsemane thing, he was praying, right? So this is a signal in Luke's way of narrating that something big is going to happen. So, and he takes, Peter, James, and John who consistently seem to show up as that inner circle around Jesus. And while he was praying, notice this, while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Obviously, this is it's pulling the idea of divinity. There's something going on here in terms of ordination, of consecration, of dedication, of indicating the Jesus purpose. Not that it hasn't been there before. I mean, we've already been told that he was his son in the baptism, but this is like that confirmation of it in a bigger picture. Suddenly, they saw two men, okay, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. Moses, remember, he represents the ultimate teacher of the law. Elijah represents the ultimate teacher, the ultimate prophet, the kind of like the prophet extraordinaire, okay? Moses, Elijah, Jesus. Now, let's go on. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure. Now, they appeared in glory. What does that mean? It could mean that there was a radiance to them as well. And we're speaking of his departure. That word departure is very significant. It's the same word that we have for the word Exodus. Yeah, Exodus. They were speaking of his departure. Moses had already led Israel in a departure, leading them out of slavery into the wilderness. That was that salvation event, okay? It was an Exodus. Jesus' departure, we know what he's talking about there. We know it was referring to what's going to happen on Golgotha in Jerusalem with the cross and the death. That's Jesus' Exodus. That's his thing that is the Exodus par excellence, okay? The departure, the saving, the act that he is going to accomplish, okay? They were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. We have seen them weighed down with sleep many times. We will see them eventually in the Garden of Gethsemane. But the theme that seems to come about a lot is that as God is doing what God has to do to save our sorry souls, we are just doing what we do as humans. God is still at work. We don't have to do anything to get God to do what God's doing, okay? I think that's the significance of the sleep. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, so here it's like saying, it shows them as sleepy, but yet not totally, like maybe they're in this little dreamy dreamland kind of a situation, right? They saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. So they witnessed to that. The epistle, 2 Peter, talks of it as though 2 Peter was written by Peter, possibly was, and testifies about seeing his glory. Okay, and the two men who stood with him, just as they were leaving him. Okay, just as so Moses and Elijah, just as they were leaving. So there's this meeting on the mount. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings." So just as they were leaving him, Peter was like, "Oh, wait. No, you guys can stay. Let's build a place for all of you to stay, and so we can memorialize this moment." So he says, 1 for you, 1 for Moses, and 1 for Elijah. So Peter was understanding this to be Jesus as like, oh, he's one of these kind of guys. Oh, this is the significance. Peter had it wrong though, okay? Peter had it wrong, we're gonna see that. Because the words not knowing what he said, because that's not the point of it. The point of it is not, oh, this is the third great manifestation of God in the world with this Jesus. That's what it means by not knowing what he said. Verse 34, while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. So this cloud comes in. So this is, whenever we have this big cloud, it's always a manifestation of the presence of God, okay? And this is what happened to them. Then from the cloud, so remember they're in the cloud, and they hear a voice. There came a voice that said, and notice the speaking here is speaking to the disciples. Could also be speaking to Moses and Elijah. This is my son, my chosen. Okay, that word for chosen could also mean, be my beloved. We get that in other manuscripts, but it's probable that some manuscripts use beloved there because they're used to hearing that from the baptism story. But this is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. So Peter, remember, he's all in this world of, oh, this is great. Let's build 3 dwellings. Oh, this is great. We got 3 great teachers. And it's like God is saying, Peter, this is my son, my chosen. Listen to him, okay? Those other guys, they were great. They had their role and they did a great job. And yes, we got to just let them pass because this is my son, my chosen. Listen to him, okay? This is very significant. When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. So that voice that spoke, that said what it said, when it was all done, Moses and Elijah gone. Like I said, I never asked this question before, but it's very possible that's something they heard as well, although we're not told that. It's meant more for the disciples, obviously. This fits in with what the early church had to deal with like deciding, oh, are we going to be Christians who are Jewish, or are we going to be Jewish kind of Christians? And it is spoken in this way to relieve anyone of feeling a need to bring that all of that past, all of that the legalism from the past with them forward. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. So in Mark, we have a thing where we're told that Jesus sternly tells them not to tell anyone. Luke doesn't have to tell them that. It just says bluntly, oh, so they lived with the reality of something that they had witnessed, that they had seen, probably not totally understood, but did not talk about. This is the nature of the Transfiguration. It is a celebration of God's deigning to humanity, and the closest we can get to God is in this kind of form. This is old imagery, and it doesn't bespeak of a world that we can relate to so much, because we don't relate to God as being something that exists in cloud and pillar of fire and on a mountaintop. But these images are metaphorical, and they do describe the fact trying to describe as best. Human language struggles to describe divinity because we're just not, and because we're just so limiting, okay? And God is so unlimited. So therefore, we have to really strain to try to get anything communicated about divinity. And in this case, that transfiguration, it shows, trying to show that divine human encounter and how it is all, God's representative on earth is wrapped up in who Jesus is, and we can depend on that. We can trust that. This is the voice of God speaking. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. Yeah. Doesn't mean we disregard everything previous, but Jesus is why I say he is the hermeneutic through which we read the entire Bible. Yes, even the Old Testament. Because of this, he is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. So this is our lesson. This is what Transfiguration is about. Transfiguration is about us being that glory of God, of knowing that we are being transformed into the glory of God. We want others to see God through us, if that's possible. Think about that. How is it that people can see God through you? How are you doing at that? Can you even let yourself be seen as something that somebody can see God through? That's your challenge from Transfiguration Sunday. So that is it for